Good morning. This is John Hegler talking to you from Columbus, Ohio. It's a beautiful late October fall day here. Welcome to session 2 of 3 of my analysis of topics related to the budget deficits of the United States. An overview of session 1 is that parameters were suggested that will result in a balanced budget for the United States. The analysis was that as a country, we are short about $800 billion in annual revenues, and we spend about $1.4 trillion annually more than we should. The goal is to reach a point where the government revenues and outlays both equal about 19% of gross domestic product. You're probably wondering why I'm wearing a Santa Claus hat here in October. Well, allow me to editorialize a bit before getting into the discussion. This being election season, I can't help but notice that politicians seem to have a habit of miraculously turning into Santa Claus. I marvel at the ingenuity in the creation of new government programs or in the propensity to propose tax cuts in a variety of ways. I can't really blame politicians for behaving this way. Only Santa Claus can win elections. It is political suicide to campaign on balancing a budget, which may result in someone paying more in taxes and cutting the size of government. So the only way to solve the budget problem is to mandate by law that the budget must be balanced. If not, I can give these little 15-minute talks till doomsday and nothing is ever going to get done. So I'd like to start today by hosting a mythical debate between President Ronald Reagan and Senator Bernie Sanders. First, Mr. Senator Sanders, I'd like to ask a question. You're a proponent of higher income taxes, higher rates, tax rates that will bring in a higher level of revenues. Is that correct? Yes, sir. So, Mr. Sanders, if the current highest individual tax bracket is 37%, would you then, as an example, propose that a 70% rate would be better? Mr. Sanders replies, oh, of course, 70 is higher than 37%. That'll definitely bring in a lot more in tax revenues. Well, Senator Sanders, then if 70 is good, why don't we just go to 99%? If that's much higher than 70, so we'll really bring in a lot of taxes then. Is that correct? Senator Sanders says, well, Mr. Hegler, you're right. 99% is where I'm for that. We're really going to bring in some taxes. And now turning to President Reagan. President Reagan, you're a proponent of lower tax rates under the philosophy that lower rates foster higher rates of economic growth and therefore higher taxes. Is that correct? And President Reagan replied, yes, that is. Well, President Reagan, if the highest bracket is 37%, would you propose going to 20%? Oh, absolutely, because we'll have a booming economy and tax revenues are just flowing at 20%. Well, then, President Reagan, how about if we go to 1%? I mean, if 20% is good and 1% is much lower than 20, just think of the tax revenue and growth we'll have then. You're absolutely right. I would propose that we go to a 1% rate. Well, when you think about it, both sides of the equation, higher tax rates or lower tax rates at their extremes will result in no taxes, because at a 99% bracket, no one works anymore. And at a 1% bracket, you're really not able to move the needle at 1%. So the answer is that both extremes, there's a sweet spot. And the sweet spot, as we presented in session 1, is that seat appears to be somewhere around 19% of gross domestic product. So that's where we really get that goal that I think our country needs to get to. So next, I'd like to discuss the proposition that billionaires pay less tax in terms of percentages than their secretaries. We've heard that bandied about here in the last couple of years. I recently heard a CNBC commentator, himself a billionaire, a multi-billionaire, make the comment that, and I quote, the firefighter making $150,000 per year pays 24% in taxes. I instantly knew that the comment was factually incorrect and wanted to present several models of hypothetical taxation of annual salaries of $150,000. So I have attached a worksheet providing 5 models of U.S. taxpayers that represent a very large cross-section of taxpayers in this country. Models 1 through 3 present models of our firefighting friend with a variety of assumptions, such as where he is, whether or not he is single, married, with or without children. Model 1 exactly replicates the CNBC commentator's description of the firefighter and find that his tax liability as a percentage of gross income is 16.2%, not 24%. Models 2 and 3 assume filing statuses as being married, with Model 3 reflecting 2 children. Tax rates as a percent of gross income for these 2 models are range between 7.9% and 10.6%. Model 5 might be a proverbial secretary earning $75,000 a year whose tax liability computes to 11.7% of income. On the right side of the worksheet is a capsule summary of 4 years of tax return data for the years 2014 to 2018 of 3 of the richest men in America whose percentage taxes paid as a percentage of income ranged from 19 to 29.9%. So the myth that billionaires pay less than average Americans is thoroughly debunked. Next, I'd like to discuss corporate income taxes. The current corporate income tax rate is 21%, and corporate taxes comprise a relatively minor 9% of the total tax base of the country. Corporations are really a loss leader and should be judged on how many tax-paying employees they employ, because that's where the money is. Here's a brief look at both sides of the equation. It is estimated that raising the corporate tax rate from the current rate of 21% to 28% would result in an increase in tax revenues of about $150 billion per year. Fair enough, right? But an increase of $150 billion barely moves the needle in reducing the deficit of $2 trillion. An increase in the corporate tax rate will decrease after-tax profits of publicly traded companies by about 9%. The stock market, which is valued at a multiple of earnings, could react quite negatively to the enactment of such an increase. On the other side of the coin, let's consider an out-of-box alternative. How about reducing the rate to 10%? A radical idea, huh? Well, hear me out. The United States would then have the world's lowest tax rate on the planet. Corporate tax rates for most large companies generally range between 20 and 30%. Some examples are the UK at 25%, Australia 30%, Canada 26.5%, China 25%. Net earnings and cash flows of the aggregate of public companies will increase about 10% as a result of the decrease in the corporate tax rate. Dividends paid to investors will explode as well, providing incremental revenue to the Treasury on top of that generated as a result of the increase in the tax rate for dividends, as I discuss in the next webcast. An offset against the lower corporate tax rate could be to increase the employer's share of FICA and Medicare, which currently runs at 6.2% for FICA and 1.45% for Medicare. And perhaps we can limit this to publicly traded companies. Since the corporations will now be happily paying lower corporate income taxes, this would be an offsetting item that would generate a significant amount of payroll tax revenue for the United States Treasury. Additionally, this extra revenue would go a long way in shoring up the financially distressed Social Security system. We would have an explosion of overseas companies moving to this country. IRS would have to hire an additional 68,000 agents just to count the additional tax revenues. There's a saying in the finance world that holds true here. Money finds its way to where it is best treated. One caveat is the question, would our country have enough employees to handle the extra business? This point will go hand in hand with my suggestion in the next webcast that the U.S. government needs a significant reduction in headcount. These employees could then be transitioned over to the private sector to accommodate the upcoming economic boom. Well, that's it for today. Next session, we're going to talk about topics related to some tax breaks that lack logic and on specific ideas relative to revenues, some of which are directly tied into the idea of a steep reduction in the corporate tax rate. And we'll continue session 3 by discussing some suggestions relative to government outlays. And then we will conclude by summarizing the main points, mostly philosophical, of this whole project. See you next time.